when I was 2. The best and the worst thing happened to me. My sister Caitlin was born. Granted, there has been a ton of negatives, but there is one major benefit. Being able to throw her under the bus whenever I do something wrong. Like when my mom was mad at me for staying out too late. But what about the time Caitlin packed a bag and hid in the cornfield way past dark? The time I brought a snake into the house to keep as a pet? What about Caitlin locking a stray cat in her closet? Or what about the logical fallacy of whataboutism? The practice of essentially blame shifting to make yourself look not as bad or to distract from the original problem at hand. This tactic has made itself home in our politics and our personal lives. That's my concern, that our utilization of blame shifting not only threatens our appreciation of accountability, but also justifying the unjustifiable at a disturbing consistency. So today, let's dive right into the world of whataboutism. First, its impact, politically, then personally. Next, why we whatabout, before finally coming up with some solutions. Although America likes to be first, we can't claim this one. The technique actually originated as an old Soviet tool, in which dictators would be questioned on mass genocide, internment camps, and forced deportations, and they would then shift the focus by stating, what about America's racism, slavery, and lynching of African Americans? And although both sides are obviously tragedies in themselves, whataboutism allowed both the Soviets and their audience to feel justified, just because somebody else also did wrong. And that's what makes whataboutism so dangerous. According to Dr. Helena Liu, lecturer from the University of Sydney, what about questions often end up derailing sorely needed conversations. Don't believe me? How many times have you heard someone attempt to minimize the Black Lives Matter movement with All Lives Matter? Or when on the topic of climate change, someone points out that China is a worse polluter than us, making action on our part useless. Not only are these lazy excuses to avoid discussions that we don't want to have, but to create the false dichotomy that all problems, regardless of context, have a moral equivalency. Take, for example, Fox News pundit Tucker Carlson, who regularly uses whataboutism in an attempt to justify his biased politics. In fact, just last September, he tried to whatabout away Kyle Rittenhouse's actions after he shot and killed 2 protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Carlson downplayed Rittenhouse's operation with, what about the looting and arson? This unproductive response on Carlson's part isn't to solve the problem of either looting or arson, but instead to simply muddy the waters as to who was morally justified. But Fox News isn't only at fault, flipping to CNN during the beginning of Donald Trump's presidency, which on one segment, critiques on Obama's immigration policies were brought to light, such as separating children from their parents, and the fact that he held the record amount of deportations during his presidential term. The CNN commentator then responded with, what about Donald Trump? As if these same actions with a different administration makes it more justified. But just because Obama locked kids in cages doesn't mean it's okay that Trump did, nor does it mean that it was ever okay. We do this with every issue under the sun, whether it be politicians arguing over who to blame for our ever increasing federal debt, or who to condemn for the mass chaos in Afghanistan. We are losing touch with rational discourse, making it extremely hard to progress as a nation. But what causes this to happen? Why do our lawmakers and representatives continue to further divide our already broken system? Well, for starters, it's a lot easier for me to admit that I stayed out too late than it is for a lawmaker to admit that they advocated for a policy that created exponential harm, especially when acknowledging defeat is associated with failure. So the simple solution is to not take responsibility at all, and to instead defend themselves with, at least I'm not as bad as the other guy. But whataboutism seeps far deeper than our politics, but also our personal lives. We see it daily, usually in an attempt to undermine a problem or experience. Personally, I can't count the number of times that I have avoided finishing my oratory because what about my homework? But as time goes on, what about Skip Bigger and initiatives to shift the blame only grow greater? Take the Minnesota Supreme Court ruling in April that if a rape victim was willingly under the influence during their assault, in the words of the opinion, they were not mentally incapacitated to give consent, making it impossible for a victim to take their experience to trial, making it impossible for a victim to achieve justice, and making it impossible for a victim to reach closure. Samantha Woodward, writer from the Minnesota Daily, pointed out something insightful when she said that the ruling shifted the blame onto victims for their personal choice to drink instead of dealing with the inexcusable actions of abusers. As a survivor myself, I know the firsthand harms of whataboutism and blame shifting. 3 years ago, I was sexually assaulted by my best friend. Took everything within me to share my story. But after 2 years of it marinating in my head, I had finally built up the courage to tell the person I had trusted most. Now, I had no idea what I was expecting as a response, but the one I got definitely made me wish I had never hit send. He asked, "What about what you were wearing?" As if my poor choice in clothing was worse than what he did. I felt so diminished because the only thing worse than being a victim is sharing your story that no one really listens to, because shaming someone into silence is far easier than actually listening. Not only did his response hold me back from sharing again for another year, but also left the lasting impression that my garments acted as the moral equivalency to his unwanted hands on my body, and that I shared the blame because of it. So, what about some solutions? Well, we start by making changes in our lives dedicated to combat the use of whataboutism, which may sound difficult, but really isn't. In fact, these can be summed down into 2 simple steps. The first, we need to change our questions. According to Lena Asher, writer for The Medium, in our society where "what about this" is our first response, it is crucial that in order to avoid minimization, you have to start asking why. For example, the next time your liberal aunt complains about a new policy from Governor Noem, or your conservative grandfather posts on Facebook about vaccine mandates, instead of whatabouting away the issue, ask them why they dislike, disagree, or distrust its contents. Not only does this create more efficient questions, but also leads to more efficient answers, making the most out of our conversations. And the second, when you see someone using whataboutism, call them out! When we allow our classmates, colleagues, and politicians to escape the blame, we are only patenting an environment where they feel justified to do so. And it is our responsibility, you and I, to stop its usage in its tracks. Like when I received that response that night, as hard as it was, I shouldn't have shut down. Instead, I should have called my friend out for his flawed rhetoric. But we have to hold our politicians accountable as well. According to Kristen Stewart, professor from the University of Washington, by following our politicians to community events and on social media platforms, we are given easy access to keep hold on them. Although the occasional picture of Representative Dusty Johnson may throw off your Instagram feed, when we have multiple resources available to contact your politicians, it's a more realistic goal for all of us. So today, we dove right into the world of whataboutism. First, its impact, politically, then personally. Next, why we whatabout. Before, finally, we came up with some solutions. Although my sister isn't my favorite person, I've given up with the whatabouts. So what if she stayed the night in a cornfield? I got a peaceful night alone. So what if she locked a cat in her closet? Looks like we both wanted a pet. Whataboutism will never justify the unjustifiable. So what about that? Thank you.